Record. Please start again. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
I have one job.
No problem. Okay. All right. Hello, everyone again. Happy holidays. I'm Peggy West, the organizer, and I wanted to invite everyone to listen up. We got a great webinar here. It's been an eventful year with many, many things, and I want to wish everybody all the best in the new year. I got some interesting trivia I pulled off the internet about the top 20 mistakes that the boards make. And if you hear one or two of these, don't be alarmed, because apparently you won't be alone. But I'll run through these. I thought they were very interesting. Number one was failing to read and follow your governing documents. Number two, working outside of the board and your authority. Number three, allowing conflicts of interest. Number four, knowing how to delegate. Number five, going against the board. Number six, failing to budget properly. Number seven, allowing late dues to pile up. Number eight, failing to record and review HOA finances. Number nine, failing to update insurance. Number 10, committing fraud or embezzlement. Number 11, failing to communicate. Number 12, not asking for homeowner input. Number 13, not learning from past mistakes. 14, failing to document everything. 15, amending policies without proper review. 16, enforcing policies inconsistently. 17, forgetting to file tax returns. 18, failing to file Secretary of State documents. 19, choosing vendors improperly or too quickly. And number 20, failing to ask for professional help. So let's hear what Jane's going to tell us about all this. Before we do, let me introduce the sponsors, which I thank immensely for pulling this together. This is our last webinar of the year, and let's get started. First of all, I want to introduce Vinteum Software. This is our IT support. We have Layla Scola on. She is the Director of Customer Service and Marketing for Vinteum. Tell us about yourself and the company.
Thank you, Peggy. My name's Layla. I'm head of customer service and marketing, as Peggy said. Vinteum is a software company. We've been in the market for almost 10 years now. We provide websites and portals for homeowners, associations, and condominiums. So if you are interested in improving your communication management, which I'm sure you are, please do get in touch. I'll post my contact information in the chat.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you for all you did this whole year. Goodness. Next, I want to introduce Rudy Martin. He's the Director of Strategic Business Development and today's moderator for M2 Engineering. Rudy, tell us about yourself and what you do there.
Thank you. M2E, we are a forensic consulting firm. We deal with all of the building envelopes, the mechanical, the electrical, the plumbing. From your building's inception, from the turnover, we can help with either the developer or the association representation as expert witnesses. And then from the 25 years to 30 years age of life with the milestone inspections, we can help with that as well. I will be moderating the event today. There's a Q&A in the bottom of the screen. If you have a question, type that in. All of the attendees, you won't be able to see you, and you are on mute, so you won't be able to talk. You can chat in the chat box, but we prefer, if you have any questions, hit the Q&A. At some point, I'll either politely interrupt Jane, or we'll wait till she's done with the first segment. We'll get some of those questions answered. And I want to thank you for joining us again. Thank you, Peggy.
Hey, you're welcome. Great introduction. And I also want to introduce Autumn O'Brien, works closely with Rudy at M2E Engineering. Autumn's the marketing manager and does quite a bit. So Autumn, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. I'm marketing manager and new business development coordinator. I work in Orlando, out doing brand recognition in this area. And I work hand in hand with Rudy, and it's nice to meet you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Miranda Filmer, she works closely with Chris Clark at Munyon Paint. Miranda, tell us about yourself. Sorry.
Good morning, everyone. So I've been with them for 2 years. I support the entire marketing department. I run and coordinate all of their trade shows, their network groups, their lunches, their presentations, their anything you can possibly think of, probably. Jack of all trades, I would call it. And I'm also starting the new construction division. Let's see, family for as long as I've been and being rooted where they are, and especially for someone like me who's coming from being up north, it's been a great welcome into this area. Tampa Bay is amazing. Yeah.
And a little bit about Munyon.
Munyon is 71 years old, 72 years old since 1951. They're third generation, operated and owned. Ralph Sr. started over here with just doing painting, and then from there on, we've graduated and grown into a general contractor.
And we're back to recording. Perfect. So it is a requirement, and both 718 and 720 require it. 719 as well, cooperatives, that you have a board certification. So each of these slides may have a lot of words. I'm going to read them. And then at the end of each section, I will ask if you have any questions, or our esteemed moderator, Rudy, will help me out with that. All right, so the board certification requirement. Within 90 days after being elected or appointed to the board, which may happen if there's a resignation, each director has to certify in writing that they have read the association's declaration of covenants, articles of incorporation, bylaws, current rules and policies, and that they will work to uphold those documents, and that they will faithfully discharge their duty with a fiduciary responsibility. So you have to do this, you have to do an affidavit, or you need to take this course. So that's really the option. And oftentimes boards ask me, well, why don't I just sign the affidavit? And I say to them, well, do you really understand the declaration, bylaws, articles of incorporation, policies and procedures? Do you understand what fiduciary duty means? Perhaps taking this course is a good idea. And you can do that within 1 year before getting elected, or 90 days after. So I always let boards know, if you have a really active community, or you have people that you think might be great for the board in the future, send them to a board certification course. These are generally always free. Myself as a association attorney, and many of my colleagues offer these courses. You can see them at almost any trade show. So might as well go and hear the information, because one thing I do know, and I think you'll all agree, right? You hear something once, maybe you get it. Hear something twice, hopefully you get it. Maybe not. Maybe you need to hear it differently, right? So coming back to do board certification every year is a good idea, regardless of the requirement. Finally, how long is it good for? That's always the question, right? So the certification of either signing the affidavit or taking this course is valid for the uninterrupted term of your board service. What does that mean? Well, if you get upset and you resign in a fit of rage, and then you go back on the board, you will have to take this course again. That's what that means. Or if you've taken the course and then you're no longer on the board and you come back to the board in the future, you need to take it again, okay? Now, if you don't do these things, if you don't take the course or sign the affidavit, you will be suspended from the board until such time that you comply with that requirement. And the board can fill your vacancy while you're in that period of suspension. So just something to contemplate. And then finally, the written certification, which is either the affidavit that you will sign, which I'm not providing you, I'm going to provide you instead an educational certificate after this course, needs to be kept in your official records of the association for 5 years. And we will talk about official records later on in the course. All right, so that's why we're here. And today's agenda is the following. I'm going to talk a little bit about the foundation of governance. We're going to talk about board members and their fiduciary duties. I think I saw in the Q&A right away, there's some questions around board meetings and quorum. We're going to cover that as well. Official business records, we'll discuss. Financial reporting and reserves. I'm going to give you a quick overview about how that impacts you from SB4D, but this is not an intensive course on that. In fact, my last webinar with Peggy and this great sponsorship crew was on that. So there's a separate course that's a full hour just about that. Then we'll talk about contracts and bid requirements. We'll talk about maintaining the association property through what's called covenant enforcement. And then we're just going to pull it all together and talk about how this all is part of mastering the business of your association. So there are definitely other topics you need to learn as a board member, but these are the topics that the division requires for this particular course. But like Jimmy said earlier, he is an election monitor. Elections in and of themselves are something that you need to learn. So I'm just going to share with you, this is not exhaustive. This is an overview, and I call it a beginning to your education. All right. So I've said it once, I'm going to say it again. The association is a business. It is a not-for-profit business in Florida. So this context, I think, is really critical because many people join a board because there's something they're upset about. It's the same reason we have people get elected to office, because they want to change something that they didn't like that impacted them personally. But I will tell you, you need to look at it as a not-for-profit business, meaning you are stewarding the property values of your home and your community. And it's really important to remember this because every year in your budget, you will have a $61.50 charge, and that is to renew your annual report with the Division of Corporations for the state of Florida. So every year you revisit it and you say, yes, we are a business. Yes, we are a business. Yes, we are a business. And if you're not, you've expired, you need to go back in, you've been dissolved. You would have to actually renew that. But every year you do that, it should be part of your budget. So the foundation of an association is the documents. So let me take you back to the time that you purchased your home or your condominium. Think about that time, right? At some point, somebody probably gave you more than just your closing packet. They gave you probably a large stack of papers. This is the declaration. Sometimes people just call it the rules. They just say, oh, this is the bylaws. Oh, that's the deck. So there are documents that are provided to you, and that is the foundation of what an association is based on. So it's really important that you get familiar with them. And now I'm going to go into them in a little bit more detail. Oops, wrong way. Okay, whoops, sorry. My mouse action, here we go. So the first document you need to know about is the Articles of Incorporation, and that's how the business was established. And that is actually listed at sunbiz.org, which is the Division of Corporations website for the state of Florida. It's also where you'll see your annual report, the 6150 I just mentioned. You'll see a listing of every year the annual report was there, or whether you were dissolved and reinstated. You'll also see the articles. Now, the articles are important. Surprisingly, older associations have some restrictions in their articles. So what normally should be in the recorded declaration may be found in the articles. So you want to just make sure you have them, because sometimes the articles will state things like the number of board members, which normally should be in the bylaws. So it's just important. You need to make sure you get your hands on the Articles of Incorporation. Second, bylaws. So bylaws of an association is really how the business itself runs. So it should speak to your election procedures. It should speak to the number of officers you have. It should speak to the duties and the rights and responsibilities of the association. Now, much of that is statutory, meaning it is in the statutes, 718 condominium statute, 719 cooperative statute, 720 the homeowners association statute. But the bylaws are again critical, because if you're in an HOA, your elections are governed by your bylaws. If you're in a condominium, that's not the case, but it still might have some information in there that you need to know. So things like quorum, which is one of the questions that I saw earlier, is listed in the bylaws generally. Finally, there is the larger packet, which is called the Declaration of Covenants and Restrictions, and any amendments thereto. So what's important about the declaration, it's called Covenants and Restrictions. These are the rights and restrictions that run with your land. So what does that mean, run with the land? So when an association is formed, the Declaration of Covenants and Restrictions is recorded in the county in which your property is located. And it actually encumbers your land in the sense it doesn't stop you from having clean title, but it runs with your land. So the world is what's called on notice about those rights and restrictions that run with the land. Now, you could purchase in an HOA or condo and not be told about a particular restriction, and may say, well, no one ever told me about that. Well, that doesn't matter, because it runs with the land. And because theoretically at closing, you should have received a copy. And even if you didn't, you're on public notice that it's there. So the declaration and the amendments are critical. And I will note that the amendments must be recorded to be effective. So one of the top 20 things that board members do wrong that Peggy kicked us off with was actually interpreting your own policies and procedures or just creating them. Yeah, you really need legal support on that, because whether it is a policy that can be created by the board or whether it needs to be voted on by the owners is a super important distinction. So something like trying to change a rental cap, or the number of units that may be rented, or that you even get to approve or disapprove of new sales, all have to be amendments recorded, not just passed, but recorded. So very important. Okay. So those are the 3 main documents. Now there's more. There are the Florida statutes, which I've just enumerated for you, okay? But you'll notice at the end of that list, I have not just 7, 18, 19 to 20, but I have 617. 617 is the not-for-profit statute. I would call it the gap filler. From time to time, if 7, 18, 19, or 20 don't address something, the not-for-profit statute, because you are a not-for-profit business, may apply. So you want to be sure that you're aware of that. And then the reason I have the ellipsis there at the end, the ... is because, welcome, there's a whole lot of other laws that will impact you in your association. Things from parking, towing regulations to emotional support animals, all statutory. So there's a lot to know about Florida statutes. You don't need to memorize it all. This is just so you remember, there may be some other place to look. The other part is Administrative Code 61B. So what is the Administrative Code? So the Administrative Code is more detail about the statutory laws that are in 7, 18, 19, and 20. So Jimmy, who's an election monitor, will tell you, and I'm sure he'll agree with me, that in the Administrative Code is where you're going to find all the details about your election. Oh, that the ballot has to be in alphabetical order. Oh, that when the first ballot is open, we can't accept any other ballots. You're not going to see that in the statute. You're going to see that there. Jimmy, am I right about that?
That is absolutely correct, 100%, Jane.
Yeah, so the Administrative Code is important. And the reason I tell you about this is it's easy to Google. You can Google Florida Administrative Code 61B, and you can see the actual rules that have been created that really expand and provide detail for the statute. The other 2 things that I have listed here are really in the world of legal interpretation, but I think it's important that you know that a statute might say one thing, but the arbitration decision from the Division of Condominiums, Timeshares, and Mobile Homes, which does have an ombudsman, Spencer Hennings, they have an arbitration division that will give rulings on interpretation. So we may have a decision that is nuanced, which is always the case, that may give you a different interpretation of what you're reading in black and white in the statute. So it's important to know that you can get the decisions on the division's website. They're not too searchable, but they are available. And that is something that your attorneys, whoever they are going to be looking at when they give you legal opinions. And then finally, there's court decisions, which everybody understands. But there's something about this. If you read the court decision from Palm Beach and you think, well, then all associations can do that. It's not the case. It's district by district. And unless it's a Supreme Court decision, it can change by district. So I would tell you, common law, it doesn't mean it necessarily applies to you. There's always, again, nuances. I think this is why we're in business as lawyers, when you come to us with a question, it may seem so simple, but I can promise you, this is almost the checklist of what an attorney goes through. Let me go back. Even if I know the answer, I'm going to go back and I'm going to check, because you never know when some strange provision shows up in another part of the association's governing documents. Okay, so moral of this story is they're all distinct. And a bylaw is not a declaration, and a declaration is not an article, and that there's a lot that governs associations. So definitely be sure to have great professionals work with you, and that CAMs as well understand a lot of this. All right. I've added this in. Most recently, we've done a lot of MRTA work. So this only applies to HOAs. If you're in a condo, you don't need to listen. If you're in an HOA, homeowners association, this is important. There's something called the Marketable Record Title Act, and it was created some time ago to ensure that there was clean title, and that title related back to the root deed. And so in this situation, it applies only to an HOA, saying it again. And basically what it means is that the declaration of covenants and restrictions can expire. So in a condo, they never expire. They run with the land into perpetuity forever. In an HOA, they may expire, all depending on a legal analysis. So don't make this decision on your own. This is definitely a legal opinion. And it doesn't just mean, what is the date that my declaration was recorded? There's a lot more analysis to it. We call it a Swiss cheese analysis, because some homes may not be subject to MRTA and some may not. But in theory, I want you to understand there's a 30-year time limitation, and that associations can preserve the covenants. It's really easy. So if you do it before it expires, it's a board vote. Super easy. If you do it after it expires, you have to revitalize them, and that is a unit owner vote. And that is much more complicated, pretty expensive, because it requires not only a unit owner vote in a meeting, but you have to send out the full declaration. Moreover, we have to submit it to the Department of Economic Opportunity, DEO, and they approve of MRTA revitalization. So I would tell you, any attorney that is doing collections for you definitely checks MRTA for their HOA. If they don't, it's real questionable, but they should be. And it's an important thing, because we don't want to try to enforce covenants or collect assessments when covenants are expired. Okay, so we're going to go in the next section. Do we have any questions regarding what I just spoke about? I will turn over to Rudy. Let me know.
We have some questions just in general. A board consists of 5 members. 2 of the board members meet with 2 members of the finance committee without announcing it to the condo owners. What is the definition of a meeting that has to be announced to all the condo owners?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that actually in this section, but I'll give you the short answer, which is the definition of a meeting is when a quorum of board members meet to conduct business. So the analysis you just gave me of a 5-member board with only 2 members meeting with 2 committee members would not constitute a quorum and would not require notice.
Okay. With the increase of association insurance, can condos use reserve funds to pay for insurance premiums?
Oh, very interesting. So we will talk about that in reserves. And I literally responded to a client this morning about this. So reserves are statutory, and you can only reuse reserves for another purpose if you get a vote of the owners. And also this analysis requires the question of, is your reserves, are they pooled or are they straight line? Are they for a particular subject? So probably in that situation, I would definitely encourage you to seek advice of legal counsel so you do it properly.
So when an association wants to change the condo docs, how do they do that, and how much does it cost?
Yeah, great. So how they do it is through what's called an amendment, which is a legal drafting. So you have to have an attorney draft that for you. The board would vote on the amendment language to then present to the owners at a duly noticed meeting, which is generally 14 days in advance. And then the owners would have to vote. The threshold on approval depends on your governing documents, on whether your bylaws or your declaration requires, you know, a majority, a supermajority, 2/3, 77 1/3. I've seen all kinds of figures. I can't tell you what that is. And, you know, the cost varies. It depends on your attorney. And you probably need to speak to your attorney directly to find out on how to do that. I would tell you, as a practical tip, if you're just amending 1 or 2 provisions, you know, that's not a ton of work. But if you're doing many amendments, you may want to consider what's called an amended and restated declaration, where you're actually doing a slew of amendments, and then you're restating the entire declaration. And in those situations, I've had boards want to remove words like developer and things of that nature, although not necessary from a legal point of view, but easier on the reader. So you may want to just consider that conversation with your attorney.
So on Sunbiz, are there recorded convenience, or only the article is recorded there?
Yeah, only the articles on Sunbiz. So Sunbiz is the division of corporation. So they just have the annual report that's filed and your articles, because your articles is how the business was established. And then the annual report you pay every year. Your county recorder's office, so like here, Broward County Recorders, Palm Beach Recorders, Miami Property Recorder will have the actual declaration. So a couple tricky things. You can do that in a public search, but it is not dispositive, which means, you know, I have clients sometimes say, well, I already did it. Please don't spend money pulling it. And I say, well, if I don't pull it the way we pull it as attorneys, which is to pull what's called an ownership and encumbrance report from a title underwriter as if we were purchasing or selling the unit, then I can't be 100% sure that I got the categorized amendments or declaration. So you need an O&E report to be 100% sure, but there is a public search. You can definitely look. And there is a category, I think, in all 3 South counties that has condominium documents as an option.
Does every condo need to hire a CPA firm? Someone just came on a board and the 1099s were prepared by the property manager. Are they qualified to do that type of work?
Yeah, so well, one, with your property manager, you need to determine whether they've been contracted to do that work. Anyone can issue a 1099. I mean, as a business on my own, I could do that. Whether I think I'm qualified to do that or whether a CPA should do that is a different question. But there isn't like a requirement in the law about that.
It's all relative. It's all situational. Depends
100%.
on how big your association is and the funds available. You don't have to have a committee at an association. A lot of these associations have a construction committee or a finance committee. Are you required to have any of these committees?
Committees serve at the pleasure of the board, and they're not required unless your governing documents or your bylaws or your articles require that you have committees. I've never seen any committee be required other than an architectural review committee in an HOA situation.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. All right, we're going to keep going.
Yes.
I've got a lot of slides. Okay, here we go. So we're going to talk now about board members and fiduciary duty. So, you know, it's always good to start with sort of the basics, right? Like, what's the context? Well, the purpose of an association is to preserve and maintain the common elements as well as manage the not-for-profit business. So there's really no other purpose. It's, you know, it's not, to your last question, Rudy, right? Like, the purpose of the association is not to create social venture unless your documents require it, unless you're John Knox Village and they put that in there. Mostly it is just to preserve and maintain common elements and manage the business of the association, okay? What authority does the board have? Well, the authority is limited to the powers and duties in the governing documents and Florida statutes. So all the things that you just talked about. What authority do individual board members hold? This is very important. Board members have apparent authority to sign contracts and bind the association. So if you're a board member, even if you didn't get consensus from a board, from your board, you may actually sign a contract and bind the association. The vendor on the other side can say, well, we've checked Sunbiz. They were listed on the annual report as a director. You know, we believe that we have a valid contract. And I will tell you they probably do. So boards really want to be sure that you consider what your policies are and who signs a contract and when that's done. I would memorialize it in meeting minutes, because if somebody does that, then they've gone outside their authority, ultra vires, they're outside the authority of the board, and then they could be held personally responsible for whatever happened. Okay, now, of course, that requires legal interpretation, lawsuits, etc. But I just want you to understand the concept that board members have the apparent authority to sign contracts, especially when vendors, like the sponsors here today, check Sunbiz to make sure they've got someone who can legally sign. All right, who serves on the board? Always check your documents first. But in short order, statutes do require president, secretary, treasurer. Those are different positions with different people under 617. And there is a minimum of 3 directors. That's also in 617. So I think that's important because bylaws may say this is a 5-member board, may say it's a 9-member board. As long as you have a minimum of 3, what that protects the association from is what's called receivership. So if you have only 2 people running that board and only 2 people listed in Sunbiz, another unit owner could sue to have what's called a receiver come in and be appointed by the court to run your association, and they are not cheap. You don't want to get into receivership. It's generally used when a corporation is dissolving and a court is trying to protect assets, but the same interpretation has come for when there's less than 3 people on the board of directors in this situation. Okay. So who's eligible to be on the board? So unit owners are members of the association, except in developer controlled communities. Now, I will also say check your governing documents, because as an election, I'm also an election monitor from time to time when Mr. Hennings needs some help. And I've seen documents where, you know, non-owners can be board members. It's pretty amazing. So just be clear that you check governing documents, but generally it is unit owners. And then there are two exceptions to this. So if a unit owner is 90 days delinquent for any monetary obligation, that means anything, not just assessments. It could include fines or other fees that are due to the association. The member is deemed, and if they're a board member, they're deemed to abandon their position. So a couple things. So if you're 90 days delinquent, you are not eligible for the board. The board would have to actually determine that you're not eligible at a duly noticed meeting and not let you be on the ballot. They can't just like make that up when they decide. But it needs to be done at a duly noticed meeting. Also, if you're a current board member, you will have deemed to abandon your position, and guess what they can do then? Appoint somebody to take your spot. And the other thing that stops you from actually being a board member is being charged with felony theft of embezzlement of association funds. I've never seen that in 17 years, never seen it. But I know it happens because we read stories out of the Miami Herald and the Sun Sentinel, and it certainly does happen. Okay. So who does what? I think it's important. The president, you know, and by the way, this is not statutory. This is from my experience, but I think it's a good framework. The president oversees day-to-day administration, and that can be in conjunction with a licensed CAM or a management company, and serves as a spokesperson to the community. So my little caveat there is if you do have a management company or licensed CAM working for you, you have by contract given them the authority to handle certain things. It doesn't mean that you do the items that the CAM needs to be doing in their contract. When I say you oversee it, it could be confirming that your vendor, the CAM or the management company, has done the things that they're supposed to do. I just say that because sometimes there's a micromanagement thing that happens. Next is a treasurer. They are the custodian of the funds. They oversee financials, and they're ultimately responsible for sound accounting practices. So we don't expect the treasurer to be an accountant or a CPA. That's useful, certainly. But they, you know, should be sure if you are in the treasurer position that you determine that you've got the right, if management's doing 1099s, like the question before, or whether you have a CPA. And as we go further in the course, we're going to talk about the financial reporting requirements. So you want to be sure in that section as a treasurer that you understand, that you have them and how they work. Then there is a secretary who's a custodian of the records. Another section we're going to be talking about, official records. So you want to be able to ensure records are available for members and kept for business purposes. So when we get to that section, any secretaries want to take note. And then the vice president, the directors, and others assume duties as defined by the board and or the governing documents. Okay. So I'm going to go into a little bit what's called fiduciary duty. So each officer and director of the board has a fiduciary obligation to the members of the association. So what this means is that the board should always act within the authority of the board and act in good faith and in the interest of the community. I say to you, this did not say best interest. So please note, we are all human beings. We have different points of view about what's best, right? Your decision should be in the interest of the community, not in your own self-serving interest. And that's what's most important. And if people don't like what you think is in the interest of the community, that's okay. They can run for the board. They can provide their opinion. You can listen to them. But just because it's not the best opinion doesn't mean that it's the wrong opinion. So fiduciary duty under 720 and both 718 and 719, everyone's got a fiduciary duty, just as we defined it. I think 718's definition is great because it again points you back to see that 617 is being used in that statute. So as required by 617.0830, an officer, director, or agent shall discharge their duties in good faith with the care an ordinarily prudent person in a like position would exercise under similar circumstances, and in a manner he or she reasonably believes to be in the interests of the association. So again, not best interests. And what does it mean? An ordinarily prudent person in a like position would exercise under same or similar circumstances. What that means is this board certification course is really your standard. So that, again, you're going to notice this is general in review. We don't expect you to be experts, okay? But the standard that you will be charged against or compared to is somebody else in the same position on a board in same circumstances, okay? So it's very different than from professional license point of view, as an attorney, as a CAM, as an engineer, as an architect. You know, there's a lot in construction, or banking even, there's a lot of different professional standards. Your standard is of another volunteer, is what I tell you. Now, an officer, director, or agent shall be liable for monetary damages if that person breaches or fails to perform their duties, and the breach or failure to perform those duties constitutes a violation of criminal law, a transaction from which that person derived an improper personal benefit, either directly or indirectly, or constitutes recklessness or an act or omission that was in bad faith with malicious purpose or in a manner exhibiting wanton and willful disregard of human rights, safety, and property. Now that is a lot to say. So let's break it down. You can't commit crimes. Crimes are kickbacks. Crimes are stealing money. Crimes is embezzlement. Crimes is paying off vendors or having vendors pay you, right? So that is a crime. The next thing is where you get a personal benefit. So if you choose a landscaping company that's going to do your second home, you know, throwing it in there, that doesn't work. Or that painting contract, you say, well, you know, could you just paint also maybe my fence? Or actually, you know what, my son's fence, that's 5 doors down, that is improper. It's an indirect personal benefit, okay? And then if you do something that's in bad faith, malicious purpose, or in a manner that you are disregarding safety. So I think, you know, I probably don't need to, I think everybody knows about Surfside. I mean, you really have to say to yourself, at what point are you disregarding human rights, safety, and property? So you don't want to play ignorance. It is not a defense. Head in the sand does not work. It may not have been in bad faith or malicious purpose, but willful disregard, you need to consider. And I'm not speaking to them directly. I'm just letting you know, like, think about how that all works. It's something to contemplate. Okay. Next, these are also new. So forgery of a ballot envelope or voting certificate used in a condominium association election is punishable. Theft and embezzlement of funds of a condominium association is also punishable. The destruction of or refusal to allow inspection or copying of official records of an association that's accessible to all owners, which we're going to talk about, is also punishable as a crime, all 3 of them. Any officer or director charged by information or indictment with a crime referenced in this paragraph can be removed from office and the vacancy can be filled. If a criminal charge is pending against an officer or director, he or she may not be appointed or elected to the position and may not have access to the official records. However, if the charges are resolved without a finding of guilt, they may be reinstated. So if you're in that situation, it is a tricky situation. I just want you to remember that we talked about it today and that you should go seek legal advice for sure. So I've told you a lot about what's awful and scary about fiduciary duty. Let me tell you what is not so scary, is just being in compliance with your fiduciary duty. It's taking action, okay? So how do you do that? Well, you enforce the documents, you establish sound fiscal policies, you maintain accurate records, you have rules and regulations, you have adequate insurance, you participate, and you hire trusted advisors like legal, accounting, management, engineers, and election monitors. Not all required, right? But makes good sense. So if you think about fiduciary duty, this is how you maintain it. And really, Peggy's list of 20 things that you shouldn't do, I think we could probably flip it into the 20 ways to keep in line with your fiduciary duty, right? So that's how you do it. Now, one issue that always comes up, people always want to talk about, is what about kickbacks specifically? So I said to you, kickbacks are illegal. I think everybody knows that, right? Like that doesn't really work to bribe or take a benefit. But this is how it's enumerated. An officer, director, or manager may not, managers included, by the way, may not solicit, offer to accept, or accept any good or service of value for which consideration has not been provided for their benefit, for the benefit of a family member, from any person providing that good or service to the association. That's the legal lingo. Basically, you can't take anything. You don't get a trip on a cruise. You don't get tickets on the new Spirit Airlines. You don't get Universal for the weekend. You don't get anything. In an HOA, if the board finds that an officer or director has violated this subsection, the board shall immediately remove them from office. The vacancy is filled according to law until the end of the director's term. However, an officer, director, or manager may with a value of less than $25 per individual or received in connection with a trade fair or education program. So that's why when you go to things like L&M's Condo and HOA Expo or the Cooperator, they can give you stuff and bring you lunch, but it's in conjunction with the trade fair or education program. Finally, in condominiums, it is a civil penalty as well, and it does not prohibit an officer or director, again, from doing the same thing at the trade fair or education show. So I think it's really common sense to remember that you shouldn't take any bribes, really is what that is. But you can receive some when you're in an educational setting or a trade show. That's the easy line to remember. So the next thing that is always asked about is what if directors enter a contract with the association? So what does that mean? Well, somebody on your board owns a painting company, a roofing company, is a CPA, is an attorney that wants to give you legal services, okay? So it doesn't mean automatically there's a conflict. I hear that all the time. It's conflict of interest. I say, well, let's look at it. So the statute actually provides that if an association enters into a contract or other transaction with any of its directors or a corporation, firm, or association not affiliated with them, or with any entity in which a director is also a director or is financially interested, right? The board must comply with the requirements of 617. Again, notice 617 is listed, which basically means that the contract has to be fair and reasonable. They have to enter a disclosure into the meeting minutes so they voluntarily disclose their interest. And then it has to be approved by affirmative vote of 2/3 of the directors present. So that's different. Generally, it's a majority approval by directors, but this is 2/3. It's like a super majority. And then here's the kicker. At the next regular or special meeting of members, which would be in most associations an annual meeting, but if they have a special meeting for amendments, it may need to be disclosed there. You have to disclose the existence of the contract to the other members. Upon motion by any member at that meeting, the contract or transaction can be brought up for a vote and may be canceled by a majority of the members present. If the members cancel the contract, the association is only responsible for the reasonable value of goods and services provided up to the time of cancellation and is not liable for any termination fee, liquidated damages, or penalty for such cancellation. For those who know a lot about contract, that actually provides a lot of safety for an association, but you must do the disclosure. And again, this is not a situation that comes up until it does, but when it does, you will remember you heard about this and ask your attorney. So what about directors voting at the meeting? A director of the association who is present at a meeting of its board at which action or on any corporate matter is to be taken is presumed to have assented to the action unless they affirmatively vote or abstain from voting. So you have to affirmatively do that, or else you're considered to actually be in agreement. A director of the association who abstains from voting on any action on a corporate matter shall be presumed to have taken no position. So when you're doing your meeting minutes, it's not a yes or no, it's just a no position. And directors may not vote by proxy or by secret ballot at board meetings, except that officers may be elected by secret ballot. So generally in condominium associations and most HOAs, after the directors are all brought in, then the officers are chosen by the directors, and that can be done by secret ballot. That's what that's referring to. And a vote or abstention for each member present shall be recorded in the meeting minutes. So, getting it all done. Board meetings. Any questions so far?
We got a bunch.
Even for me to just be talking, I'm like, let me take a break. Any questions?
My favorite question of them all is, do you have a YouTube channel?
I don't yet, but I should.
I mean, it's got to get on the list for next year, 100%. So what are, you spoke about contracts, and for official records, can you give guidelines on the topic of storing for viewing purposes, contracts and proposals? Like number one, if if it's not a contract, but a quote or a proposal, do you have to post it? And number two, if it is a proposal for large jobs, before, after a vote was taken, like what do you have to post? Where's the transparency?
I'm actually going to talk about that in official records, and I have a section on contracts and bids, but bids should be kept for at least a year. And then any contracts, I mean, really your bottom line rule is 7 years. Although with the new SB 4D, it's 15 years for inspection reports, which could also be considered the contract and inspection report. So
just to clarify, if a CPA is on the board, is it okay to do business with their place of employment if the board members agree?
Yeah, they then need to use that disclosure that I just talked about, guys. So if the CPA is on the board and you want to use their CPA firm, they have an indirect benefit, a financial interest. You need to do the disclosure properly. And it's just a matter of doing it properly. 2/3 vote by the board. It's a fair and reasonable contract. And that I would actually use those, the motion is that the contract is fair and reasonable. The board is going to need to vote by 2/3, and then we're going to disclose it at our next meeting.
So there's a lot of lazy unit owners that don't want to get involved, and that's fine. They just want to live in their condo and be left alone. If the rules of the HOA state that a majority of homeowners must approve amendments to rules, but the community of homeowners only pay their HOAs and never participate in voting, what recourse does an HOA have to address issues that have been arising over time?
It's really tough because you don't have the right to pass those rules and regulations unless you get that vote. So the first thing I do with my clients is I counsel them to treat it like a political campaign. Host a barbecue, get your members out, figure out what they like, and then get them to vote there. So have the ballots ready, do the proper meeting in advance. And then the other option is go door to door. But if you can't get them, and I've had that situation before where it's just not possible, get with your attorney to look at some creative ways. I'm not going to say you can pass rules and regulations, but we've come up with ways to get to the root problem in a different way. We might find a provision in the declaration that's already in place that we can say this falls under this provision, therefore the board can make a rule or regulation about that. That's also an interpretation issue. Generally, we've had boards that say rules and regulations have to be approved by owners, and we've been able to say the particular rules are already circumvented by federal statute or state statute. So I think you need to go one by one with your attorney through that.
Is there any individuals or companies that can be hired to review an annual budget and advise if they're properly leveraging the appropriate monthly fees in order to support the community?
Really good association accountants should be able to do that with you. Good CPAs should be able to look at your budget. And I know sometimes you're not getting that level, but when you hire a vendor, when you go through that process, I mean, that's what I would be asking is, what does the conversation look like to talk about our budget? It's a great question. Also with your management companies, I'd be asking the same thing, like, how do you guys analyze our budgets? Do you analyze our budgets? What do you think is best practice? And then I don't know any at the top, but Jimmy being on this call and being a private election monitor, I do know that there's private consultants in the association world that may do this work. So I think it's a matter of just trying to hone in and find the right vendor. Jimmy, you know anybody that does that particularly?
Right off the top of my head, no, but yeah, you have to ask around, and you have to ask business professionals. You have to ask people who know, not just your neighbor because they know somebody else.
Right. I think asking the right questions is the most important thing to your vendor, right? So if you go to your CPA and say, yes, you file our, very simple tax return for the HOA or the condo, could you look at our budget? Do you have the ability, asking those questions of them and seeing if they can provide it? And then, frankly, you can also ask your attorneys. Some attorneys will have that experience, some attorneys will not. So, ask the question of all the professionals in your space.
Reserve specialists too can also kind of help with budgeting.
Yes.
So since windows are to be inspected under the new law, is the association now responsible for replacement of the windows that don't pass inspection? Is that an engineer question?
That is I am not going to answer that question because I'm going to use the card because right now, I mean, I'm having a conversation tomorrow night with a state representative. There's a whole lot of discussion around changes to SB 40. You can also send in a question to the division and ask them for an interpretation if you'd like, but I think you need to speak to your attorney, and your attorney is probably going to tell you to slow down and hold for this next legislative session unless you have a situation right now where you need to replace windows. And if that's the case, then they may treat the interpretation a little differently.
So that glitch bill that you're speaking of is in March, hopefully, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're just going to clean up some of the language like this.
Hopefully, yes. There's, I mean, a
Yeah.
lot of people have been giving a lot of commentary on the glitch bill. So yeah, there's a lot to look at.
Yep. So I have a view there, and so there's a line item for windows, and we'll tell you what the remaining life is and how much it's going to cost. You guys can fight about who's supposed to pay for it. We ask that we just tell you how much it's going to cost, and seek a lawyer or some legal advice on exactly who is supposed to cost based on your documents. So hopefully they clean that language up with some other language. So yes, that's a good question. What's the difference between a member and an owner?
Member means owner. Generally, the owner is considered a member of the association, unless your documents have some very strange provision that allow non-owner members to be there, but it's generally synonymous.
What do you do about that dictator president that's adamant about not having any committees or any input from unit owners?
You start your campaign now, figure out who your candidate is, and you get them elected, and make sure you have a majority of the board, because you're not electing a president, you're electing a board that will then appoint a president that would be better suited for your community.
This is more of a tax question. I don't know if you can help. What form is used for HOA taxes by the IRS?
It's an 1120, I think, off the top of my head.
Okay.
I think it's the 1120. I could be wrong. I think it's an 1120.
So there are 3 members of a 5-person board, and they're all friends. What guidelines should the board members follow to stay legal? Can they meet socially at the point and they stay away from condo business?
I love it. So I'm going to
area.
I'm going to use that question to talk about this slide, and I will answer the question. Okay.
Excellent. Let's get into it.
Yeah. So if you look at this slide right now, a meeting of the board occurs whenever quorum of the board gathers to discuss business. And so when they gather to discuss business, that's the key, right? And it's a quorum. So if you've got 3 friends, it's a great scenario, 3 friends on a 5-member board, I'm going to tell you they need to be very clear that they do not discuss board business when they're together. If they like to drink wine every Friday or coffee every Thursday morning, you just need to be very clear that they say we do not discuss board business. We only do that at meetings. And when people make those accusations, they need to be able to say, hey, we're friends. Like, there's nothing that stops us from being friends because we volunteered to help this community. So we are very clear that we do not discuss board business. It's the #1 accusation unit owners throw out. So I think just having the right line is important in that situation. And of course that they're actually doing that, right?
Jane, I want to share an experience. The first time it happened was about 8 years ago. I was at a restaurant, and there was 3 people that are on a board, and we were having a couple cocktails. And one of the people said, I can't believe how expensive that proposal is. And somebody snapped their head at them and said, hey, we're not discussing any condo business. They drew a line in the sand, and I was like, whoa. And then I was always interested about condo law after that, because it was such a firm line drawn in the sand. And I thought it was very interesting. And that's what needs to happen in that situation.
Absolutely, what needs to happen and why. So the question is like, why would we say that? Well, because unit owners have the right to attend all meetings and speak on all designated items, subject to rules and regulations about the frequency, manner, and duration of their statements. So, remember, contextually, again, context is decisive. An association's not-for-profit business is also transparent in nature. Like the whole point of it is that the decisions made about the property that you own and what's going to impact it should be at a duly noticed meeting. And I'm going to just make the side point. This is not sunshine law, folks. Sunshine law is governmental in nature only, period. Sunshine does not apply to condos. But the condominium law makes it very clear that you have to have duly noticed meetings with agendas so there can be open communication. It sometimes gets confused. So I just want to make sure everyone understands that. And then also in the condominium setting, I mean, the law changed, I think it was like 4 years ago, where they said explicitly board members may not vote by email. You just can't do it. You can't have these closed meetings. So again, the idea that it's transparent is what's important. So the question, this came up earlier, but just to be very clear, quorum is simply defined as a majority unless a lower number is defined in your bylaws. So, these are, if it's 3, it's 2, it's 5, it's 3, 7 if it's 4. And all board meetings are open to all members except for meetings with the attorney to discuss proposed or pending litigation, okay, or meetings to discuss personnel issue. Personnel issues are like your management contracts or the managers that you hire or your staff. Now, notice they both have an asterisk. Meeting notice is still required. You still have to do 24-hour notice, okay, in a conspicuous place. I mean, 48-hour notice in a conspicuous place, but you do not have to allow people into that meeting. Okay, so you still have to notice the meeting. And the next slide is how that works. So 48 hours in advance, the notice of meeting should specifically identify agenda items, should be posted in conspicuous place, or if there is no place to post, it may be mailed to each member 7 days prior. If you have closed circuit broadcasting, which some really nice buildings might have, that's okay, that's an option. If you have allowed email notification, that's also an option, but that 48 hours is still required. In an HOA, more than 100 members, bylaws may provide alternative publication notice, so you got to look at that. And in a condo, if the agenda does not include an item, the item may be taken up on an emergency basis by at least a majority plus one of the board members, right? Because you may not have every item on there and oops, we need to talk about it. So the next couple of slides I have for you, I'm not going to go over exhaustively. I'd like you to look at them when you get the slides because it's a great little graph of meeting notice requirements. So when board meetings are required, when budget meetings are required, when annual meetings are required, without election, which is generally like amendments, okay? But I do want to point out we've been in budget season and I've had a couple complaints that have come through where boards have failed to provide the notice of the budget meeting with the proposed budget. So they've, keep that in mind. So this will come out in the notes, but I just want to show you the rest. It's pretty exhaustive. Annual meetings with elections. This is the election process in a condominium, and in HOA, it's different. Non-emergency special assessments always require 14 days notice. Board meetings to adopt rules regarding unit owner parcel. So any rules regulations also requires 14 days notice. Committee meetings, tricky wicket, right? Because committees can be created by the board or they can be in your actual documents. Committees that take final action on behalf of the board have to have that same 48-hour notice. Committees that do not take final action on behalf of the board still also have to have 48-hour notice. So even your social committees and your, like holiday committee would have to do that. Again, these attorney meetings for proposed and pending litigation and the personnel require 48 hours notice, but do not allow you to have members there. And that is a good stopping point. So now we're going to go on official records. Do we have any other questions or shall I continue?
I do.
Sure.
Is it the understanding that the president is the one that only signs contracts for the association?
So all board members have apparent authority to sign contracts. I think it's a very good idea inside of mastering the business of your association that you have a policy about who signs contracts and when, and whether you need 2 signatures or not. I think it's good, but there's no sort of like standard, only the president signs, not necessarily the case.
So if the 7 board members are meeting with an insurance agent, do they have to open up that meeting?
So as long as they're not making a decision at that meeting, you could have like an interview with an insurance agent. You can interview, attorneys, interview vendors. You don't have to have those be duly noticed meetings. They should not make the decision on that at that meeting.
If an association has no pet policy, a unit owner brings in 2 dogs and 2 cats, claims they're all emotional support animals, what does the association do? Get a pet policy?
Well, pet policies have been pretty much undermined by ESA and support animals. So in that situation, there's not much they can do, but they should speak to their attorney because of those, if you don't have a pet policy, you still could have rules for pets about how where they, go to the restroom, how you carry them in and out of the building, cleaning up after pets. I mean, there's all kinds of things you can create. But it's hard, if that question is about, can you stop them? Probably not. But they do need to follow the emotional support statute. So there is some, actual documentation that the association can request. But if you don't have a pet restriction to begin with, it seems a little silly to ask because you don't have any restrictions in your building for pets.
Should an attorney be present at all the board meetings?
not necessary. Unless
Sounds
you wanna
expensive.
it sounds very expensive. I mean, my objective is to, if I go to a board meeting, generally it's because there's like somebody there's a angry or upset owner that they know is going to come and they want some support with. But if I go to a board meeting, I generally want to just help the board learn how to run it so they can do it on their own. It seems unnecessary to spend legal funds on that, in my opinion.
Now, what about emails? That's a form of communication. How does that work as far as getting too many people included?
Well, emails, there's a lot of issues around emails. So first of all, board members in condominiums cannot make decisions by email, right? But emails are discoverable in lawsuits. And I would tell you, there was a decision that came down by the division, I think in February of this year, that said, board members' emails are considered official records of the association. So one of the things I tell new boards always to do is, if you've been using my personal emails like Jane at me.com, I'm not going to use that for board business. I'm going to create, Jane at summerlakes@gmail.com and say, hey, send me all my board stuff there. So it doesn't get caught up in my email system where it's then discoverable in the future. But there's a lot of questions around emails. It depends really on the nuanced situation.
All right, thank you.
All right, let's move on. Let's talk about official records. We are halfway through the slide deck, so doing a good job. All right, official records. These are the business records of the association, and they should be kept, including plans, permits, warranties for all the common areas, a copy of the bylaws, articles, declaration, rules and amendments thereto, 7 years of meeting minutes, current roster with mailing address. Current roster with mailing address does not include the email address of the owners unless the board has actually had owners affirmatively agree to have email communications for notices or elections. Then their emails are part of that list. If they have not done that, they're not part of that list. 7 years of insurance policies, contracts, bids must be kept for 1 year. So those are just any bids if you have an RFP that goes out. 7 years of financial records, receipts, expenditures, unit owner ledgers, and tax returns. The new inspection reports, SIRS, which is a structural integrity reserve study, that report needs to be kept for 15 years. And I believe the milestone inspection falls under everything else, which is the kitchen sink provision of this statute, which is 7 years. So I did tell you your certificates only need to be kept for 5. I think make it very simple. Everything should be kept for 7 years. You should have it accessible, and your SIRS reports need to be kept even longer. Records must be available within 45 miles of the community. I just had a client, individual owner, come in, and he was upset that he had to go to Plantation from Fort Lauderdale. And I was like, you're allowed to do that, and they can have them be available at their CPA's office, their management company office, their attorney's office, but they have to be made available, and it has to be done within 10 days after written request is received. Written request has been interpreted as an email, please show me the records, as a letter, a certified letter, a FedEx, you name it, slip it under the door, you wrote on it. You should treat any written request as a request to see the records, and then know that your 10 days are counting, okay? The 10 days are for you to respond and give them a reasonable opportunity to view the records. On the 11th day, if you don't respond, a $50 fine per day up to 10 days may arise. This is not automatic. So what I mean is, if your association has ignored your official records request, which often I have owners that retain the firm and they show me many records requests, I say it's, you don't just get to say I'm taking $500 off my assessments. You have to get a court judgment to win. So you would have to sue, and then they would have a presumption, that they did not provide you the records, right? So you'd have to get over that presumption that, they are actually keeping them from you. So what I always say is this: when they come to me, we're going to send one more letter and make the records request, and generally we get it, because really what you're looking for is not to create erroneous legal fees and billing. You are there because you actually want the records. So we just give it one more shot. That's the way to go. Now, if you haven't gotten the records and you don't want to hire an attorney, you can file an arbitration about the official records. And if you have proof that you submitted it and they haven't responded, you can ask in that arbitration to get this fine, for sure. But again, you're on your own, pro se, in that situation. So you may want legal advice, want to have a discussion, but it's not an automatic fine. The other thing that association boards say on the flip side is we don't want to give them the records because we know that Sally Joe is trying to put together a committee of people to overthrow the board, or whatever the thing is, right? There is no purpose required for records inspection. They can say, I don't care. I just want to see it, or I want to see it because I'm going to come after you, right? No purpose is required for it. So it doesn't matter. Don't ask the question. You get a request for records. You remember we are a transparent authority and we are going to provide those records. When an owner comes in, they can use portable technology to scan or make their own copies at no charge. So they can use their cell phones, they can bring in a scanner, they can, if they want to take photos, whatever they want to do. If they want you or the association, should I say, if they want the association or the board management company to actually make copies, they can charge a reasonable amount. It's 25 cents per copy. And if they have to take it out of storage, they can charge a reasonable fee for that as well. So you don't want to just hit them with a big official records request that's burdensome is the word I would use. So when you ask for records, I think as an owner, you want to be clear and concise, you want to be specific and know what you're looking for. But understand, this is not a right to get the records, it's a right to inspect the records, okay? For condominium units, over 150 units that have websites like Vinteum offers, you may have all the records online, and that's an easy way to respond by being able to send them a link. It is, you're paying an attorney, a CPA, or somebody their time to have somebody come in and inspect. So you do want to consider, do you just want to send them the record? So the right of the owner is just to inspect, but the association could meet that by actually providing the documents. I think it's a matter of common sense and what works best. Okay. All right. Any questions around official records?
Got some really good questions just in general.
Sure.
May a president make a decision regarding a contract without informing the other board members, without a vote of the board members, or brought up at a meeting?
Can they? Sure, they can do anything, but is that proper? Absolutely not. So if they make a decision, again, just like I used that example with a parent authority, if they make a decision, they have not consulted with the board, it's not codified in the meeting minutes, I would say that that board member acted outside and they're maybe personal responsibility. So all board members should understand, just because you're the president doesn't mean that you run the association. I know there are some other not-for-profit associations, sports clubs, things of that nature, where yeah, you have a whole slew of power. The way it works in an association, condo, HOA, or cooperative that is not the case.
So is it healthy for 400 plus units to be self-managed, have a board of 13 years, and they have promises of no maintenance raise or no special assessment?
Sounds like a weighted question. So if you're over 400 units, we're about to get into financial reporting. I'm going to tell you, you probably should consider management. I mean, that's a lot. You are not-for-profit volunteers. I have a personal opinion about board size. I know documents may require 13. I think 13 is a really unwieldy size for a board.
No, I think the board was there for 13 years.
The board was there for 13 years. Well, then, yeah, also. I think that's the answer is, why have they been there for 13 years? We need to get other people to run. And if you run on a platform of, we're going to bring in professional management and have this be handled, people are willing to pay for that because, in that situation, there's a lot of implication that there might be some wrongdoing. People just generally feel that way. It does not mean that that's the case. They may have just been, moving that association along. The idea of not raising assessments in today's world is ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Yeah. Folks, I don't know how many articles we need to point out about the increased cost of insurance, increased cost of goods and commodities. To say that you're going to keep assessments the same is not thinking forward. And in a condominium setting, it's impossible to do based on the new requirements of reserves. So it's an unfortunate reality, but I think you need to also look at it like there should, almost be a cost of living increase. You got to go with the flow of what's happening in the economy. How can you say things are going to be the same if you don't know the cost of insurance, utilities, and commodities moving forward? Just my belief.
Do county laws trump HOA declarations?
Haha. So we probably are concerned with like Miami-Dade County ordinances. I'm going to tell you those ordinances most likely do. I can't tell you that across the board. It's a specific situation, but if a county ordinance is requiring you to take like a 40-year inspection or to do this or do that, you absolutely need to do it. But you should get with your attorney if it's an ordinance that you believe directly conflicts with your deck. You can take a look at it. But I'd also point out to you, there's even with HOAs, there's a statute. Oh my goodness. It is a Florida landscaping statute that will actually says that association decks are trumped in certain situations, like they can't require certain kinds of grasses, and Florida friendly, that's what it is, Florida friendly landscape. So it is never a question that we can answer outright, like we got to look exactly what you're asking. But Florida statute will trump, county ordinance will trump, and you probably need to lean that's the direction and then get legal advice.
Yep. These are all great. I'll let you continue. I'll save some.
Okay. Yeah, great. All right. So we're now talking about financial reporting and reserves, everybody's favorite topic. So financial reporting, we're probably in that time period. So one of the things I talk about with my clients is that there's a business rhythm to an association, right? So what I mean by that is when you understand your calendar fiscal year, which is sometimes it's a calendar year, sometimes your fiscal year is like July 1 to June 30, you need to figure that out. It's probably in your articles or bylaws. If it's not mentioned, generally it is the calendar year. But there is a rhythm to that. And then when your elections are going to happen, because it generally states it's in this time period. So that's part of your rhythm of your business. But financial reporting rhythm is based on your calendar year or your fiscal year. And you need to decide, because there's a lot that you need to do for financial reporting outside of reserves. So if you are an association with an aggregate budget of $150,000 or less, you have to do a report of cash receipts and expenditures every year. So it's part of your business rhythm. 150,000 to 300,000, you have to do compiled financial statements. 300,000 to 500,000 is reviewed financial statements. And then finally, $500,000 up is audited financial statements. Okay. So the financial reporting is based on your operational budget, your aggregate there. In an association, in a community of fewer than 50 parcels, regardless of the annual revenue, you may prepare a report of cash receipts and expenditures in lieu of financial statements, unless your governing documents require otherwise. So in this slide, generally people ask me the question, well, who gets to do that? Cash receipts and expenditures, any competent management company or accountant can do that for you. Or bookkeeper is what I should say. Compiled financial statements can probably be done that way as well. But when you get to reviewed and audited, you really need a CPA. And I would tell you, probably you see the correlation with the amounts, it makes sense. So with that scenario before with 400 plus units, I mean, unless they have a very, 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 very small assessment, they're probably in this space and need to have a professional. So here is part of the timing that I was talking about. So within 90 days after the end of the fiscal year, the financial report for the previous year should be completed. So if your fiscal year is a calendar year, 90 days after is around the end of March, beginning of April. So within 21 days after the report is completed, but no later than 120 days after the end of the fiscal year, the association must provide each member a copy of that report or a notice that the report is available at no charge. The best practice I use when I own my management company is we just send postcards. Financial reports are available if you'd like them. Not everybody wants them, but if you're a board that prefers to send them that information, you're welcome to do that. If approved by the majority of voting interests present at a properly called meeting of the association may prepare or cause to be prepared a lower level. So a report of cash receipts and expenditures in lieu of compiled, reviewed, or audited, a report of cash receipts, expenditures, or a compiled financial statement in lieu of a review or audited. And then you could do a report of cash receipts and expenditures, compiled financial statements, or reviewed financial statements in lieu of an audited financial. So you can reduce that. Do I think that's a good idea? I don't. I think that if you are dealing with that level of cash in a budget, you should have those proper financial statements done, but you do have some flexibility here. So, next question. Are reserves required in a condominium association? So I have had to update this slide this year. The answer has always been it is required. And it has always been roofing, painting, paving, anything that costs more than $10,000 is required as a reserve. But now the structural integrity reserves study by 12/31/24, which is the date of this current statute, may change with the glitch, requires that you have reserves. And I'm going to tell you what those parts are. I think what's important here is that you understand reserves used to be able to be waived or partially funded, and that has now changed. So, very general overview. This is a class in and of itself, but the Structural Integrity Reserve Study is a study of the reserve funds for future major repairs and replacement based on visual inspection by licensed architects or engineers. Has to be done every 10 years. The first one done by 12/31/24. And here are the new components. So beyond roofing, painting, paving, and anything more than 10,000, you now have roof, load-bearing walls, other primary structures, floor, foundation, fireproofing, fire protection systems, plumbing, electrical, waterproofing, exterior painting, windows, which is the question we had before, and anything that costs more than 10K that can negatively affect these items. Folks, your assessments are definitely going up in the condominium world. I think that's why the legislature is looking at the glitch bill, not just to answer some very clear confusion that is in the bill, but also because there is going to be a financial impact for sure. Other impacts on reserves would be, I'd say, the milestone inspection report for buildings that are 3 or more in stories in height. It is going to create, because it will be considered the other things that affect it. But this milestone inspection, I actually think was a great first start. So for buildings that are 3 or more stories in height, by December 31, when the building reaches 30 years of age, or if it's only 25 years of age, if you're within 3 miles of the coast, you get an inspection. The structural inspection of the building is done by a licensed architect or engineer, and it's a 2-phase. First, they do a visual. If you pass visual, you're good. If you don't pass the visual, they can do destructive or non-destructive testing. I mean, all of that impacts reserves. So I think this is excellent. I think SIRS is what's a little confusing, but a lot of opinions about this amongst all my colleagues and many vendors probably on this call too, about how this works. But I just want you to know it's going to impact your reserves. But there's even more to reserves. So remember I told you about Administrative Code 61B? Well, that also impacts reserves because it tells us where the association can collect a single payment and it's not considered commingling, provided that they transfer the reserve amount to a separate deposit account, right? So this is super important. Commingling of funds is never a good thing in an association, but in this situation, we don't want you to have to make 2 payments when you're doing the same thing. So operational funding and then reserve funding, but it has to be separated. Reserves may be removed or reduced by a majority vote. Oh, I'm sorry, I can't believe that's still in there. That should not be in there anymore. Please ignore that. I'm going to strike it through. That has been changed, obviously, with this, and I missed that in my review. My apologies. So we're just going to move on. I'm going to strike through that whole thing, and then I'll send it to you. Reserve calculation, though, is also an administrative code, and they did put it in the new SIRS language. So it is the amount to be reserved is based on the remaining useful life and estimated replacement cost or deferred maintenance expense of each reserve item. So if you look here at the bottom, it gives you basically the formula. They may adjust the replacement reserve assessments annually to take into account any changes in estimates of cost of the useful life of a reserve item. So we don't have a reserve, we have engineers on this call, but not reserve specialists. You need a reserve company to do your reserve study. You cannot have a management company get 3 bids and tell you what the useful life of the roof is and what it's going to cost in the future. They do not have actuarial data. They cannot tell you what the proposed labor and cost will be in the future. You really need a company to do this. And it's something that you definitely should budget for.
Some engineering firms also do have reserve specialists. M2E is one of them. Georgette is a certified reserve specialist. She's one of our newest hires. So
excellent.
Yes, but it has to be done by a reserve specialist, not by just any designated engineer. They have to be designated a reserve specialist.
Got it. All right, I flipped over that next slide too because I missed it. Okay, so reserve funds and any interest accruing thereon shall remain in the reserve account and shall be used only for the authorized reserve expenditure unless there is a vote in advance to use that for another purpose. So I literally, before this call, shot off an email to a client about this. You don't get to just change the name of the reserve to something else. It can't be a different kind of building fund, this or that. Really, I mean, the bottom line is reserves are statutory. They are now required. You cannot reduce or waive them. And in this situation, you could use them still for another purpose if required, but it will require a unit owner vote. I think this might probably change in the glitch bill, by the way, based on the conversations I've had. All right, I'm going to keep going. Contracts and bids. Any questions? Or you want me to keep going?
We've got some good ones.
Right.
So if board members don't feel there's enough transparency, how do they handle that?
Yeah, it depends on what they mean by that, right? So if you think about that, all meetings have to be duly noticed, people can speak on agenda items, records are available, like where are they not being transparent? I'd probably need to know a little bit more about that. Because the way the statute's set up is everything is really transparent.
So if a property management firm refused to give any official records to its members of the board within 5 days, what are the board members' recourse, if any?
Yeah, so they've got 10 days to provide you a date and time to review those records. If they don't, you can file an arbitration with the Division of Condominiums, Timeshares, and Mobile Homes for the failure to produce official records.
If the annual budget is under 500,000, but there was a special assessment for 400,000, do they still need audited financials?
Oh, that's a really great question. Wow, I haven't been asked that in a very long time. So I'm gonna double check myself on this, but I believe that the financial reporting requirements are based just on the operating budget and the special assessment would be a separate entity. But I'm going to double check because I believe there's an arbitration decision on that. So I will, in my, when I send out my stuff, I'm going to answer that question about special assessments and financial reporting.
Can you explain the parcel use more, like new rules for parking? Does it exist for parking members, for all residents, tenants, things like that? Those are
anything that affects parcel use, which would be the right of ingress, egress, where you can park, how you can use the common element. So yeah, you should assume that almost everything affects parcel use. If you're doing a rule or regulation, you got to do that 14-day notice.
Can you trust these engineers that come out to do reserve studies, which will eventually impact our 2024 budget? Will they come from the DBEPR?
Yeah, so DBEPR is not, so understand the Division of Business and Professional Regulation is like the state's overarching regulatory agency for licensing. So, they're making sure that professionals are licensed properly and they've met their CEUs or CLEs, whatever it may be for their industry. But there's no guarantee about their business practice. So can you trust them? I can't answer that question, right? But what I'd say to you is, when you're dealing with any vendor, you can ask for referrals. You can go and look at the review machine that is Yelp, Google, and all of those things, although they're not dispositive. There was a time where the Better Business Bureau, BBB, was something people would look at. But I would, I think referrals, you want to speak to people, speak to other board members. That's the good thing about going to trade shows and things, and is to talk to other board members and find out who they worked with, who they liked, why they didn't. But DBPR is only going to get involved if there's a complaint against that person's license. Now, you can check on DBPR if they're licensed. I always check their license and make sure it hasn't been revoked or something strange. And if you have a complaint, that's where you go to DBPR, but there's no guarantee. No guarantee.
You need to vet these vendors just like any other vendor. You need to ask for past jobs that are similar, just like yours. You need to make sure that they can do phase 1 and do phase 2, because what's happening a lot is people are doing phase 1, but they're not qualified to do phase 2. They don't have the insurance to get on swing stages. They don't have the construction background. So you need to vet them hard, just like you vet any engineer. And then hopefully that trust will come from you and your board's decision. One more. When is AOB going to become legal?
AOB.
I was hoping you knew. I'll type a follow-up
Yeah,
question.
sorry, I'm pulling a
Yeah.
straight blank on that one. I'm like,
Okay.
okay.
All right. Thank you.
All right, yeah, ask them and maybe they can chime in.
Yes.
All right, we're nearing the end here, so we'll have plenty of time for questions, it looks like. Contracts and bids. All right. So all contracts for services must be in writing. That's important. So all of them need to be in writing. So I often get the question of like, how come we don't have a contract? Well, you should, it's required. The exception is if the business entity is the only source of supply within the county serving the association. So FP&L, waste management, you know, you don't need those. And it does not mean that the association should be hindered in obtaining needed products and services in an emergency. So when we have a state of emergency called by the governor based on generally a natural disaster, or in most recent history, COVID, we have had situations where we've had a state of emergency and you can get contracts without having them in writing, without going through a bid requirement. Why would that be? Well, you know, our friends on the West Coast, right? I mean, how would they get the trees removed and maybe water extraction services and all those kind of things that came from the last storm? So, but generally speaking, all contracts should be in writing. So when is a bid required? Let me just move this really quick. Sorry, what happened to my, I can read it. For condos, if the total amount due is more than 5% of the total budget, including reserves, then competitive bids are required. In an HOA, if the contract exceeds 10% of the total budget, including reserves, competitive bids are required. But now the question should be, what is a competitive bid? They do not define that in the statute. So if you're in a situation you have to get into bidding, I always suggest to our boards prior that they determine what the competitive bid requirement process is going to be. So if it's going to be an RFP with a closed, you know, a closed envelope submission that are only open on a certain date and time, you should make that process in advance of starting this, right? So contemplate what your actual procedure is going to be if you are in a bidding situation. And it seems silly to say this, but there's no requirement to accept the lowest bid. Just because you're going through a competitive bid process does not mean you are picking the lowest bid. So consider that, you know, personally, you don't always buy the cheapest car or the cheapest house, right? You buy what's right for you. And there are other considerations around that. And it may be things like, you know, Rudy just mentioned around, you know, you feel more comfortable with this vendor because the vendor gave you referrals of same reciprocal size associations. And, you know, you feel like that was a better part of their bid process. I mean, 100%, you can take a more expensive vendor. The exceptions to this is contracts with employees, attorneys, accountants, architects, CAMs, engineers, and landscape architects. All right. There's not a lot on contracts and bids. It always surprised me when I first created this. Maintaining association property, covenant enforcement. So this is a huge part of what the board has to handle to keep your community in a beautiful space, to make sure that it looks the way you want it to. So there's a couple ways to do that. In a homeowners association, there is something called mandatory pre-suit mediation. So if an owner has, you know, put a ton of things in the common element outside of their unit, statues and landscape ornaments, things like that, and they won't remove them, then it's not just a violation letter. You actually have to go through mandatory pre-suit mediation first. And what that means is there's a statutory letter right out of the statute, and the owner and the association pick a mutually agreeable mediator. Everybody pays 50% of the cost. Generally, they charge 2-hour minimums, and you go to mediation before you can go to a court of law. So if you try to file a lawsuit, you will get, if the attorney's right, we'll have it dismissed before you start. The other option is for arbitration, but that's only for elections or official records. So again, Division of Condominiums, Timeshares, and Mobile Homes, they will deal with your election disputes and your records disputes. And then the other option is lawsuit, but the lawsuit cannot happen generally unless you've done mandatory pre-suit mediation first, or arbitration. You don't just get to sue on those two issues. With condominiums, there's mandatory arbitration, pre-suit again. There is now a mediation option, which is new in the statute, which is, I appreciate, because many times it's just about getting both parties to the table, because, you know, A and B just couldn't see clearly, but they needed somebody else to explain the situation. And then there is a lawsuit. So I put together this handy dandy list that you'll get on your PDF. So, you know, when the issues come up, you can see. So election disputes, arbitration, recall of directors, arbitration, notice of meetings, properly conducting meetings, official records requests, requiring an owner to take an action or not to take an action based on the rules and regulations, declaration of covenants and restrictions, altering or adding the common area, all require arbitration or mediation first. Then there are some areas that don't, okay? So if it deals with title to the unit or the common element, straight to a lawsuit. Interpretation or enforcement of a warranty, straight to a lawsuit. Collection of assessment or fees, straight to a lawsuit. Eviction or removal of a tenant, straight to the lawsuit. Breach of fiduciary duty, lawsuit. Damages for failure to maintain, lawsuit. So I think this is useful. I mean, as a board member, I would definitely keep this handy. It's useful to remember. And this is more of an explanation of how mandatory pre-suit arbitration works. So prior to instituting court litigation, you file a petition with the division for non-binding arbitration. So the reason I tell you that is it's non-binding. So it does not mean it is a final court order. It can be appealed in the circuit court of your jurisdiction. The petition is only cost $50 to file. So this is the reason that this was created by the legislature, is they didn't want to back up the courts with really condo disputes amongst people, right? Between board members and owners. The petition has to recite the following, which is very important. You must have given this person, the unit owner, written notice of the specific nature of the dispute in advance. So you don't just get to file this, you've got to send them a violation letter. And they have to have a reasonable opportunity to comply with that. So it's not reasonable if you say, you have a basketball, what is it called? Basketball hoop at the end of your driveway. It must be removed in the next 12 hours. It's not reasonable. You give them 10 days, it's reasonable. You know, and depending on situations and timing and what's happening in the world, you got to look at what's reasonable. It's always a subject of interpretation. Notice of the intent, and then your letter has to have the notice of the intent to file an arbitration petition or other legal action in absence of the resolution of the dispute. So look, bottom line is, somebody's violating the declaration. You don't just get to go willy-nilly to arbitration, mediation, or court. You must give them that demand letter first. And that demand letter has to be written properly. Oftentimes we get them and we say we have to issue a new one because it was probably missing number 3, or the reasonable opportunity to comply was not there. You know, it was just you did this and that's it. You know, you didn't give them a way to cure it. I think this is important. So once you get into arbitration, if this should happen, there can be a motion to stay the arbitration if you need emergency relief. And that emergency relief has to have something that supports an entry of a temporary injunction. So, you know, there might be situations, and we've seen it. Let me give you an example. Unit owner changing their floors in a condominium unit, you know, with the wrong flooring and a sound issue and no soundproofing. Rather than have to go through arbitration, you could actually seek an actual temporary injunction. And we were able to do that by staying the arbitration. But again, let your attorneys do this. I just want you to know that's a possibility. It's not just like it's not just one lane. You know, there's other pathways once you get started. Also, even though you have the right to mediate before arbitration, in the middle of arbitration, a party may request for mediation. Even, I think the most important part about this, which is the irony, is notwithstanding a lack of agreement by all parties, the arbitrator may refer it to just mediation at any time. So although they attempt to say that there should be an agreement between the parties for mediation, arbitrator can say this just needs to go to mediation. And then finally, the decision itself has to be presented to parties in writing. The arbitration decision is final in those disputes in which the parties agree to be bound. So remember, I told you this was not binding. If for some reason they ask you to have it be binding, I would always decline. And the reason that I would say that is because the arbitration is conducted by the Division of Condominiums, Timeshares, and Mobile Homes. They do a great job, but it is essentially a trial by phone. A trial by phone. So you don't want to be bound by that because and arbitrators can get it wrong. So you want the ability to appeal. And then if arbitration is also final, if you don't appeal it within 30 days, so you have the opportunity to file it in the court of competent jurisdiction, which is in your jurisdiction within 30 days. And then like the number one money question is who pays for that, right? So prevailing party in arbitration proceeding shall be awarded the cost of arbitration and reasonable attorney's fees in the amount determined by the arbitrator. So again, reasonableness is not something, that you can say this is reasonable, this is not reasonable. Arbitrator often cuts fees for attorneys. Does not mean that you aren't left holding the bag to pay those fees, whether you're a unit owner suing or an association suing. The party who files a complaint may seek a trial de novo, which is an appeal. But here's the trick with the appeal. If the judgment is not more favorable than the arbitration decision, you can get stuck with attorney's fees and costs. So there's a lot of considerations when you're dealing with arbitration, and especially when you're appealing it. Now, final section here, I think this is my closeout, is around fines. So enforcement can be done for both condominiums and HOAs with fines. And I think there was a fining question that we had earlier, Rudy, so that'll be good to go to. So an association may levy reasonable fines for the failure of the unit owner or its occupant, licensee, or invitee to comply with any provision of the declaration, association bylaws, or reasonable rules of the association. So the owner has to comply, their occupants, their guests, any licensee that they have, or any invitee. So in a closed community, large home community, we've seen where FedEx drivers have been dropping off packages. They were able to ascertain that it was going only to that home. Did not comply with the parking and the speed rules in the community, which is another asterisk thing you have to do properly, but we're able to hold the owner responsible for that. I don't know how they dealt with FedEx after it was over, but it did happen. So condominiums, a fine may be levied on the basis of each day of a continuing violation with a single notice and opportunity for hearing. However, the fine may not exceed $100 per violation or $1,000 in the aggregate, period. That's all you've got. In an HOA, a fine may not exceed $100 per violation or $1,000 in the aggregate unless the governing documents provide otherwise. It would be a place where if you think that hitting the pocketbook owners in an HOA is more impactful, you could go to. Now, this is the most important part about fining. And I will tell you, we have won arbitrations on this. We've won cases on this. You have to do it properly. So a fine or suspension may not be imposed unless the association first provides 14 days written notice and an opportunity for a hearing to the unit owner, and if applicable to the occupant, licensee, or invitee. So this is how it works. Board gets together. They say we want to levy a fine. They have to give 14 days notice. And if that fine has to do with the owner's occupant or tenant, they have to be noticed as well. They have to have 14 days notice of that hearing, okay? The hearing must be held before a committee of other unit owners who are neither board members or persons residing in a board member's household. Cannot be board members, cannot be spouses, cannot be partners, cannot be people living with the board. If the committee does not agree, the fine or suspension may not be imposed. If they don't agree with the board, it is not imposed. Upon approval, the association must notify the unit owner, and if applicable, the unit owner's occupant, licensee, or invitee by mail or hand delivery. The number one thing you need to understand about fines is they are not liens on your property. You cannot foreclose on these fines. You can collect them on estoppels when the properties change hands. You can sue in court for breach of contract for failing to pay the fine, but they do not become liens against the unit. And the big distinction between condos and HOAs is that $1,000 limit, depending on the documents. But technically speaking, must do it the right way. Must do it the right way. If you don't, I've seen many, many fines get vacated for this purpose. All right, Rudy, you had questions on fines. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, can a condo impose an admin fee in addition to or in lien of a fine for non-compliance?
Ooh, admin fee, I like it. So I think a couple ways that you would need to do that. One, you would need to have that in your somewhere in your governing documents, I think you would need to have it as a rule or regulation or part of what you say that it's going to be there, because then think about that, right? You get 14 days notice for any change in rule or regulation. You're now adding something that impacts this parcel use in the sense of a fine coming to you. Yeah, I think you could do it. I think you could do it, but it needs to be done properly. And if you're a condo or HOA, it might be slightly different. I think it's possible.
Should bids be presented at an association meeting and members be able to ask questions before voting, or can the board just say that they have bids and decide on their own?
Here's the tough reality. Generally, the board can just decide on their own. So board members, the board can, subject to rules, regulations on time, frequency, and duration of members' statements, they can choose not to hear your statements until the very end of the meeting. I think a good board and a well-run meeting will allow unit owners to speak on the item that is there, but generally the board can make a decision and then you can have just one space where unit owners get to make statements. So it's not provided that you get the opportunity to speak on that specific thing. You will be able to speak on that agenda item, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be done before the board voted on it.
And the board doesn't have to show you those documents or the proposal.
They should. So if a board was to tell me that they didn't show the documents at the meeting, I tell them, why would you do that? Because they're totally subject to official records, right? So the records are available. Now you're having the unit owner go through this process. They're going to get more irritated with you. There's no reason not to show the bids at that time. Now, is there anything in the law that says you must show them at that time? No, but how does the unit owner get them? Through official records, which we exhausted, right? So you go through that process.
And technically, they don't have to listen to anything at all. You voted for them. You appointed them to make decisions on your property. Imagine a board taking the opinion of all 400 unit owners on a concrete restoration project. There's not enough time in the day. So that's a great question. And that question was asked quite a bit. Can a fine committee be chaired by a board member? A fine committee?
No.
That's intense.
No.
Is there such things as fine committees?
Yes, that's what we just talked about. You can have a fine committee. Yeah, violation committee, grievance committee, fine committee. But the board member cannot be on that fine committee and they cannot chair it.
Is a fine approved by a committee and the action or issue continues, does the committee need to approve future fines for the same exact thing?
Yes.
Every fine?
Yes. Got to follow the same procedure. 14 days notice, board members levy the fine, 14 day notice, opportunity to be heard at a hearing, and then it's approved or disapproved for every violation.
Can a board move forward with a multi-million-dollar bank load for concrete restoration for 20 years instead of a special without giving the owners option of a special assessment over the 20 years? Do they get to decide whether they want a loan or an assessment?
That's a board decision. Unless your governing documents have some provision around special assessments over a certain percentage of the operating budget, which I have seen, could require a unit owner vote. But if you don't have that provision, it is a board decision.
We're not going to get to all these questions. I have a few more. We're going to print some of these out and try to answer these in a follow-up email. So everybody be patient, but there are some really good ones here. What is the process for adding eviction on the bylaws / articles for problems of renters? Do the HOA even have the power to do so?
To evict?
Yeah.
So
or to change the bylaws of the articles about the topic of eviction.
Yeah. So you don't have the right to stand in the shoes of the owner in that situation. So the only place in association law where you can go after an eviction is for failure to pay assessments. And that's a very tricky wicket, which I didn't even get into today, but you do have the right to demand rent from tenants whose owners are past due. And then you may evict under that statute, but you don't just get to evict an owner. You could, if your documents allow you to terminate the lease, you would handle it, but it wouldn't technically be an eviction under Chapter 83, landlord versus tenant. So that's like a nuance in the legal analysis of it. So in that situation where a tenant is maybe violating the rules and regulations, we could seek, to terminate the lease, certainly, but I wouldn't call it an eviction under Statute 83. That's
the AOB is the assignment of benefits regarding insurance.
Yes. Okay. Oh, AOB. Got it.
Yes.
course, I knew that.
So
I
did
was like, what is assignment of benefits? Okay, so what was the original question for that?
I believe when's it going to be legal?
That a board can assign benefits?
Yeah.
I no crystal ball. Speak to your state representatives. I have no idea.
A board cannot vote by email, but if a board needs to communicate to make decisions on day-to-day work or execute things that have been voted on at notice meetings, is that legal? What are the limits on how they can discuss as a board without having meeting or be considered voting by email?
Yeah, so I think you can have discuss. So if you've already voted on something and you're talking about the execution of it, I don't think that's a problem at all. You can't make the decision to do something via email, but you could have discussions around pros and cons, what we heard from the, like, look, if you're interviewing an attorney, a vendor, here's pros and cons, these are the discussion, but the decision, the actual business that you're making the decision to hire and or, even terminate a vendor, you need to do at a duly noticed meeting. So, but I think discussions are fine. But remember, your emails are discoverable now. So I really want to caution you to be careful what you put in your emails. Really caution you about that.
Can condos impose different rules for parkings for tenants versus owners? Owners occupied or tenant occupied? Can there be different rules?
That's an interesting question. So rules for parking, I would have to look at what they wanted to do. I mean, generally it should be evenly displayed, but there are situations where you have valets. And so tenants have parking spaces, there's guest spaces. I mean, it's a possibility. I can't tell you a straight yes or no on that.
Are there rules for owners and not for tenants, say access to the gym or access to certain parts of the property? I mean, is there a line
absolutely
drawn?
Yeah, owners don't get to double dip, right? So if the owner is renting their unit, doesn't mean they just get access to the gym, right? So they've now assigned their rights to use the common elements to tenants. So there's no double dipping in that way, I think, if that's the question.
Yeah, but what if an owner, you have owner and owner in unit A, and then there's a tenant in unit B. In unit B, do they have different rules and regulations that they have to follow? One as an owner and one as a tenant? Like maybe the tenant can't have access to certain parts of the building, but that owner in unit A can. Like, do you see that a lot?
No,
no,
I don't see that a lot. And I think it would be very hard to do that. That's why with the parking question, I have seen some shiftiness around the valet stuff, but I don't think in the use of common elements. I mean, if the tenant has taken it, I don't see how you can say a tenant can't use X, Y, or Z.
In elections, can you campaign door to door? Can you put flyers under the door? Can you add that flyer to their personal space under their door? Can you slide that? Can you cross that line of their privacy? Slide that flyer under their door.
Goodness. So, that's a great question. So you can campaign and you cannot open mailboxes. We know that's a federal offense. Could you slide it under their door? I think you could. Could someone make an argument that was a nuisance or something else? Maybe. But I think for all intents and purposes, you probably could. But I can't tell you that wouldn't come with redress of some sort.
We have great feedback. Everyone loves this webinar. There's no way we're going to get to all these questions. Merry Christmas, happy holidays to you. Marcia had to leave early. She's got a doctor's appointment. Thank you, Marcia. Good luck at that. You guys, just great feedback, great questions, Jane. It's so interesting. And we'll have a follow-up email. Will the slides be available?
Yeah, slides will be available.
Yes.
I think I would just want to end with this, just one thought, right? Remember that it is a not-for-profit situation and everyone is a volunteer. Everyone is volunteering and everyone's just doing the best that they can. And I think when you look at this course is designed to give a general overview, but it really opens up way more questions than it does provide you with concrete things to do, despite my real attempt to give you that. But you constantly want to go back to context is decisive and the association is a business and treat it that way. I think the best associations have boards that do not all agree, that have split votes all the time, but they can shake hands and walk out the door and they don't need police and they don't need security. where everybody can just understand that everyone's doing the best that they can. And I think when you look at it like a business and you start to create things like a business rhythm, a calendar, then, next, because for me, the real question is, what does succession look like on a board? Because, oftentimes board members get elected and nobody gave them any succession planning. You don't even know. The manager starts sending you financial reports and you're like, what is this? So I think, start to think about that just like you would if you owned your own business. When you bring in somebody new, do you just like throw them in the position, or do you give them an outline of what they need to do? And do you take the time to say, hey, I was a secretary, let me tell the secretary what to do? There's a lot that we can cover. It has been very robust discussion. I really appreciate it. And after this course, certificates are going to be emailed to you. My firm will send them to you directly along with a copy of the slides. And if you don't already follow the Florida Community Association Journal, you should. It's really our industry journal for community associations. We have been voted in every year, and it is voting time. And I think all the vendors and sponsors on this call are probably looking for a vote too. So please thank us by voting for us. And yeah, it's been really fun. I'm happy to create a YouTube channel in 2023. Talk about all the things that property managers need to know and board members.
Excellent. Peggy, close us out. What a great webinar. Thank you,
Yes,
everybody.
what a great webinar, Jane. That's why I always love to have you as one of our primary speakers. And in closing, I just want to tell you, everybody, I'm so excited to announce that on January 19th, I want you to mark your calendars. I'm having an attorney jamboree. It's going to be 5 well-known attorneys in South Florida that are going to speak on various topics. And then they're going to have questions for 5 minutes. And at the very end, it'll be open mic. So anyone can ask any question about any topic. And I hope you can attend. It'll be from 12 until 2, a 2-hour presentation. And past that, I want to thank my sponsors again. Have a wonderful holiday season, everyone. And we'll see you in the new year. Thank you.
Happy holidays.
Thank
Happy
you
New
all.
Year.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Great job, Jane. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you all.
Happy New
Have a
Year.
good one. All right.